Andriy, it's absolutely great to meet you. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me.
It's absolutely great to talk to you. Thank you for taking some time to talk to me.
Would you like to start by introducing yourself and telling a little bit about what you do? Give me a 250-word.
All right. Andriy Kulykov has an experience of working in media for 39 years, and he started as a loyal propagandist of the Soviet way of life. After some time of toeing the party line, he understood that it's enough of lying or making believe. And from some time, he and a couple of friends in the newspaper, the News from Ukraine, started to refurbish the newspaper. We became not a propaganda leaflet, but rather a serious information source. After this was love with radio, and this affair lasted for 3.5 years at the BBC World Service in London, then back to Ukraine because it's more interesting here. I worked in television for 5 years, then back again to London in the moment of weakness, and then in the moment of strength, back again to Ukraine. Since 2007, I've been presenting a major political talk show at one of the major Ukrainian commercial TV channels, but radio is more important. So since 2013, with a group of friends, we founded the first ever, or rather the only, not the first, but the only, which survives now, the only independent talking radio station in Ukraine. Wow. And it's basically it. How many words?
I want to say that was 252, but I'm not sure.
All right.
We'll count later. You talked about how many different positions you've had. Can you talk maybe about how media has changed in an overall sense in the time that you've been in the industry?
I do hope that my lifetime has not expired yet, so it still remains to be seen how it will change. But if we take Ukraine specifically, we went from a press-dominated society to television-dominated society, or rather, I say that the biggest myth that the Ukrainian television is spreading is that it is almost omnipotent. In reality, people do not make their choices, especially in politics, according to what they see on television. But it is very attractive for people who pay for the television, and this is Ukrainian tycoons, to instill in us the feeling of whatever we do, whatever we think, whatever we pay attention to, we will to the television line. That's why they put so much money into television and all this. However, I still think that the Ukrainian society is very much resistant to propaganda, and Ukrainian audience basically is a rather skeptical one, very inquisitive. Unfortunately, they are not accustomed to quality journalism. And if you have the best audience, but they are not accustomed to quality, then they may reject quality for quite some time, and sometimes even for a very long time. So media literacy is very, very important to Ukrainian society, and that's why I want to thank you very much for instilling and promoting media literacy in Ukraine.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's work like what you've done that makes this kind of thing possible. So in relation to that, we talk about, obviously, with modern media, we have social media, and we have podcasts, and we have blogs. And so can you talk about what is the role of those things in media today versus what is the role of traditional media still in our society?
A big question here is when a non-traditional media becomes a traditional media. And in the respect of social media, frankly, I think that this is a very much invented term and phenomenon. We've had social media and citizens journalism for decades or maybe even hundreds of years. In the Soviet Union, you had their form of citizen journalism. They were called workers and collective farmers correspondence or student correspondence. And our newspapers were flooded with letters from them. Half of those letters were fake letters, in the sense that they were written by people who worked for actual newspapers. But half of them were real. Sometimes they were naive, sometimes they were even empty, but lots of people wanted and managed to voice their opinion even in those times. Not to talk about the public broadcasting system in the US, which was there for, again, dozens of years. And, well, I suppose that many people would know that community radio, for instance, which to my mind is one of the bulwarks of citizens journalism, was born in Bolivia in 1950s. The matter was that local miners who went on prolonged strikes wanted to expand the knowledge about them. They were illiterate. They could not write and publish, but they could talk. So they founded first small radio stations. This was citizens journalism. Later, citizens journalism flourished in the form of the so-called pirate radio stations in Europe, whereby you could not listen to rock and roll apart from pirate radio stations or the American military stations on military bases. So I think that sometimes we are reinventing what has been there for quite some time. Again, remember that the bow of the times of the Cultural Revolution in China, where people were actually instigated to write their opinions. It was used by the ruling political class in a struggle, but many people could not understand that they were being used and acted out of sincere wish to change, to inform. Social media. I once said that when we publish reviews or analysis like how social media reacted to this and that, we might as well publish something what they wrote on fences after something has happened. But a very knowledgeable person told me that in ancient Rome, when people were dissatisfied with what was happening on the forum, they actually wrote on fences. So yes, it has been there for ages and ages. And the only thing is that now these phenomena use technological achievements, and this makes them more spottable, yes, and we pay more attention to it. And I think that traditional media, well, again, what's traditional media? Back in 1940s, television was not a traditional media. Back in 1990s, the internet was not traditional media. Now it is. What's next? So, I think that social media may survive as long as traditional media pays unjustifiable attention to it. As soon as we forget about it, the attention to it will dwindle. We already see some signs of this, and I still think that the best way for a successful so-called citizen journalism or social media person to disseminate their views or the information that they achieve is to go to professionals.
That's really interesting, the comparison between people writing on fences back in the Roman time and people writing on Facebook walls now.
Yes, absolutely, and we even find parallels in how this is called. And you know, this is a kind of a virtual world that is being created. I don't think that I'm saying anything new in this respect. And many people understand this. They just do not want to go against the flow. But let's take any British newspaper. They still have, every British newspaper has a page of readers' letters. And it doesn't matter that previously they got them in envelopes and now they get them on email. A letter is a letter. And this is a very important thing that we in Ukraine lack. Feedback from the audience and constant contact with the audience. After all, it was in The Guardian, as far as I remember, that they first introduced the reader's editor position. This is very important. This was there in the Soviet times, like it was called letters department, but it was very, very ideological, and it was not the right way to do. But the idea to keep track on what the audience thinks and how they react to what you publish is very good.
I want to talk a little bit about how people choose what news is newsworthy and how certain events become important news stories and other ones don't. And so I guess in your experience throughout the variety of experience that you've had, who says what is the news and who has kind of an influence on that?
Two countries, 7 or 8 media outlets, the situation was different in every one of them. Of course, even at the bulwark of democracy and traditional free thinking, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, at the BBC you still had, when I started to work there, the so-called central pot of stories, whereby people who worked for the language services in the world service of the BBC were first of all obliged to look into the central pot, take several stories from there, insert them in their news bulletin, newscast, and then add some regional or local stories. And this is also about centralized dissemination of news. So in this case, it was some pundits and very experienced British, mostly British journalists, who decided what was important for Ukrainians or Finns or Russians or people in Vietnam to listen to, because there was a central pot. Then I tell you, I was in my second year of service, and 3 or 4 minutes before I was to go on air with the newscast, there was a flash of stories from Kazakhstan. It came from Kazakh agencies and one international agency, I think it was Reuters. Having had virtually no time, I just printed out 3 or 4 of them, took this bunch of papers to the news studio and composed the story as the newscast went. I don't think it was a perfect story, but it was okay from the point of view that it had different sources, it had unbiased presenter, it had, and all this kind of stuff. However, I was severely reprimanded after doing this because I was told, you should have rung the central news desk and tell them, there are stories coming out of Kazakhstan. Could you please write a story for me, for my newscast, 3 minutes or 4 minutes before you go on air? So, okay, they would write a perfect story, of this I'm absolutely sure, but they would write this in English. Then I would wait for the story, get it in English, translate it into Ukrainian, and probably it will make to the next newscast. That's the choice that you face. That's about who makes decisions. And very often in Ukraine, especially in Ukraine from my experience, a journalist has to make her or his own choice and go against the flow and understand that the interests of the public at any given time are more important than your personal interests. It's a blessing when you can combine both, but this does not happen very often.
So you talked about the central desk at the BBC. So I want to ask you about what influence do owners of media versus editors versus the journalists themselves have on creating what the news story is about and how you spin it?
I think you forget one very important person here, the manager.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, because there's the owner, they have their own used. There's, okay, let's talk about the editor, who is basically interested or should be interested in the growth of authority and prestige and readership or viewership or listenership or usership of their media outlet. There are journalists who are interested, as we all are, in disseminating information, but also in making our own cases and in excelling, basically. But there's a manager who is responsible before the owner for the commercial success of the media outlet, which does not always run parallel to the authority and prestige. So in some cases, and I've known this, and I actually worked at one of such television channels, it is the manager who has the right, although I'll put it into inverted commas, the right to tell what kind of stories are more important today than the others. And then the editor's task in this imperfect system to accept this and try to tell about this in the most interesting way. I mean, organize the work of the journalists. To my mind, the editor is or has always to be the pivotal figure of any media outlet, and it is them who should define editorial policy and them who should always take counsel with rank and file journalists, because those are people who draw the field and they actually see and palpate and smell sometimes what's happening around. And then, of course, there's such thing as sensationalism, to which we all fell prey apart from owners. Owners do not love sensationalism. Even if it does not concern them directly, it is something unexpected. They would rather that everything goes according to the schedule. They are shown at 1500, then at 1845. Some good words said about this, but editors, managers, and journalists fell prey to sensationalism because every category does want the success of the media outlet and their personal success for different reasons, but this is what actually unites us. And sometimes we have very sore effects of what's happening. Remember that even the Pulitzer Prize was once bestowed to the completely invented story, Jimmy's Life. And this was about a 8-year-old boy in one of the black suburbs of Washington, D.C., who was on cocaine or some other infused drug. So, and of course, in this case, the lady who wrote this story was probably the first culprit, but where were the editors who did not check anything in this story? And they did not check because it was a good, sensational story. It promised a huge success to the Washington Post, I think. So in our cases, in Ukrainian case, I think that anyway, although the editor is the key figure, a rank and file reporter, general assignment reporter, is the one on whom depends the emergence of the story. It is them who on the spot can decide whether this is worthy of further discussion and dissemination. And sometimes it takes a huge level of courage for girls and guys who work in our profession to insist on their point of view. I don't mean on their opinion, on their point of view of the story.
Can you tell me about an experience when you as a journalist received some pushback from either the owners or other people involved in the process in creating a story?
A person who actually taught me television, although he was 10 years younger than me, I was very good in print and radio, but I knew actually nothing about television. And Alexander Tkachenko, who now heads the 1+1 group, and who's become a different person since then, he actually taught me what television is. When he had to leave 1+1 television channel for political reasons, because he was at that time a very brave and critically minded journalist, I was appointed after some adventures to head the news service instead of him. And I was taken by the owners. By the way, here we have another personage who comes, the, how we tell it, the behind the scene mover. Sure. I was taken to the behind the scene mover, Mr. Rabinovich, who at that time, although he had no shares in 1+1, he had no official position at 1+1, but he told the owners what to do. And they introduced me to him, and he says, well, I don't care what his surname is, I don't care what language he speaks, I don't care whether he's a man or a woman, just do not show Yulia Tymoshenko on television. Then he thought for a while and said, and the less you say, show Alexander Moroz, the better, although I cannot forbid to show Alexander Moroz, who at the same time was chair of the Ukrainian parliament. But still, okay, I was so shocked that I didn't say nothing. And he understood this as my consent. I understood this as my, at least, that I abstained from giving my consent to him. When I came back, within 2 hours that they took me there and then back, it happened so that on this day, Yulia Tymoshenko, who then was a prominent opposition politician, who is still a prominent opposition politician, and this was in 22 years ago, or 21 years ago, she did something that deserved to be in the news. And when I came back, the piece of news was already ready. And I said, okay, of course, it should go, if not on top of the bulletin, then second slot in the newscast. So it went on air, and the next morning I was dismissed from the position of director of the news service. Wow. I am not unique in this. And we know of a television newsreader. There was a famous story again with Miss Yulia Tymoshenko. She was a prime minister at that time, and she recorded an appeal or address to the Ukrainian nation with a prompter. And when she sat and looked at the prompter, suddenly all the text went blank. And she said, "Пропало все," which in Russian means everything's vanished, or everything is lost. And you understand, of course, that when a prime minister says everything is lost, many people tend to sort of interpret it in different ways. Yeah. So as soon as she said this, her press service started to call all the television channels, because the cameras were on, asking them not to show this scene. However, there was one guy at Novy channel at that time. He was both a presenter, newsreader, and the editor of the news service, who did show this. Next day, he was dismissed from both these positions by the owner. No, well, by the manager, but I know for sure because this was the same media holding. So this is what happens. But actually, if we still have some time, I would rather tell you a story which taught me not to lie. And for instance, my non-desire to obey Mr. Rabinovich's order or request very much dates back to 1985 or 84, when I was sent to a collective farm in Chernivtsi region to write a portrait of a milk lady, milk woman who worked there. She was a brilliant person, very robust, clever. She obviously knew everything about milking cows, so I liked her very much, and portraits are one of my least favorite genres, but this was one of the 2 or 3 that I really enjoyed writing. But then I was working for a newspaper which went to the USA and Canada and some other such capitalist countries, and I had to think about how I would convince my readers that life in the USSR is better than in those bad capitalist countries. So there was a lack of something material in this portrait. And I sat and sat for several hours, and then I thought, okay, I wasn't to America at that time, or to Canada, or to any other capitalist country. I thought, Americans love cars, and they think that a car is more important than anything else. Let me write that Vasilina, her name was Vasilina, earns as much that within a year she can afford buying a car. And this would be a good argument for Americans. Okay, I put this into the story. My editor-in-chief signed the article. It went to foreign countries, and in 3 or 4 weeks a man comes to me, you know, or sort of a person under whose suit jacket you can read shoulder loops or shoulder blades. And he says, you know, they reacted to your article in the Émigré press. Do you want to have a look? And the Émigré press was the term for newspapers published in Ukrainian or English in the USA and Canada by descendants of Ukrainian immigrants. Of course, I want to have a look. And then he shows me a copy of the article about my article, not even the entire page of the publication, because there may be something ideological there. And I don't remember the headline. The headline was probably not very good, but it started with does propagandist Kulykov even know how much a car costs in the Soviet Union, that he writes that a simple milk woman from collective farm may. So by inserting one piece of lie into a generally very good article, I spoiled it all, and that was a very, very potent lesson to me. I did not accept it at once. I took a piece of paper, a pencil, and I went to a quiet place, and within 2 or 3 hours I convinced myself that yes, if she doesn't eat anything except of what she grows at her plot of land, if she doesn't buy new clothes, if she doesn't go to the district center and saves on bus fares, maybe she will be able to collect some money for such a car. But that was so shameful when you have to convince yourself that you told the truth. That this was the case that gave me first the understanding that a small lie can spoil a very good cause, that people do notice, that people do care about whether they are told truth or lies. And when I encountered different difficult situations in the future, I always remembered this case and a couple of similar cases and found in them the energy to resist. And this is what I always tell my younger colleagues. Think about whether you yourself would spend much time trying to prove to yourself that you told truth. If you have problems with this, just cut it away and write truth.
I mean, that's obviously a very good point on not lying. That's good advice. But what should or maybe can a journalist do when they are receiving those kind of pressures?
My first advice is to upgrade their skills. The more qualified, the more skillful a journalist is, the harder it is for a manager or the editor or sometimes the owner to dismiss them or to make them do what they do not want to do. Because, well, it's obvious, if you are a good reporter or a popular radio or television presenter or a blogger for this matter, it is much more this, if you are being fired or put to another job, this leads to losses on the part of the owner and the manager. So they tend to treat such people who have high qualification and high skills differently than the others. At the same time, you, when upgrading your own skills, you should not forget about people who work together with you. Because by raising your status, you may inadvertently harm their positions. So you should always share your secrets or your skills with other people. You still will be in a winning position because it was you who found this or invented this and all this kind of stuff. So you have a bit more experience in doing this than the others. But the others should be right behind you in this. And then they will support you in a different, or there's a higher probability, the possibility that they will support you. So, upgrading your skills, always having colleague-like relations with colleagues. Competition, yes, but not the fight for better topics or whatever. A union would be very, very good. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, the journalism unions are struggling. And even I, although I understand that I should be a member, I'm not a member, although I'm helping them in different other aspects. And your contact with the audience. It is the audience who in many cases may protect you in many, many respects, may even protect you against being fired. When they say, listen, we want this person to be back, we like their articles, we like their radio shows, we like their photos, we like their videos, the audience. But then again, you should listen to the audience, not only to the positive things that the audience tells you, but also to the negative things. When I worked on television and was a recognizable face, I first used to get very angry when I was told nasty things on the streets. But then I understood that it is as priceless as the positive things, because it testifies to the fact that that people are not indifferent to you and that they watch you. So, skills, colleagues, union, audience. Maybe in the Ukrainian case, audience and then union, because unions are very weak.
So with all of these things we've talked about, what should the audience know about this process to be the best consumers of media?
First of all, you should always be in contact with the audience. This we have already talked about. you should basically, these are very primitive pieces of advice and very primitive ways of behavior, but you should ride the same buses and commuter trains that the audience does, and you should go to the same supermarkets that the audience goes. And sometimes you should watch your competitors, if we talk about television, or listen to your competitors, or read your competitors, because this is what your audience does as well. They are interested not only in you, but in your competitors. And also you should put, the Ukrainian idiom is you should put their skin on, maybe the English is you should be in their shoes for a while, yes? And imagine what does it mean for them. Today I was taking part in the television marathon dedicated to the 75th anniversary of deportation of Crimean Tatars from the Crimea. And I remember that there was a very successful slogan a couple of years ago. On the 18th of May, we're all Crimean Tatars. But this is a very successful and a very wrong slogan, because it is not enough to be a Crimean Tatar on the 18th of May, because then you are a Crimean Tatar for 24 or 12 hours, and you say, hey, I'm done with this. I gave it all I could. From time to time, you should put those stories on yourself and try to understand how you would react, what would your points of interest be here, and so on. And from time to time, you should offer an alternative. One story about a children's television and radio festival which grew out of a very nasty news story which was shown, I think, 11 or 12 years ago on all the television channels in the city of Kharkiv. This is Ukraine's biggest city, and they have something like 6 or 7, or had 6 or 7 local television channels. And the head of local regional council had a rare moment when he could watch television, so he watched for his own reasons, which might not have been very noble. Maybe he wanted to see who needs control. Maybe he was just watching television news. And on all the 6 channels, the first story in the newscast, in a city where almost 1.5 million people live, was about how a group of teenagers raped a goat. Nothing more important was happening in Kharkiv at that time. And he got so enraged about this that he founded a festival where kids may make animated cartoons and films and all this kind of stuff. A naive example, and you do not always have a regional head watching your television program, but you are always there. And if you see that some aspect is lacking, it is your duty to go to your editor and say, listen, I know this and this and this story. Let's do a piece about this. Last year, we have the Ukrainian nationwide journalism award called Chest Professie, or the honor of the profession, or something like this. For the first time in many, many years, there was a new category introduced, constructive journalism. I was very much pleased when this past January I was in Bath Spa University in the United Kingdom, and I heard local theorists and practitioners talking about the need for constructive journalism. So in some cases, Ukrainians, being unaware of what's happening over there in the States or in Europe or elsewhere, they come to conclusions on their own, and this is very, very important. I think that this was what actually formed the Ukrainian journalism at the brink of the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the first 2 or 3 or 4 years of the independent Ukraine. We lived through an entire historical era within several years, and we came to, we didn't know much about what was happening in journalism in the UK or US or wherever. One of the reasons being that not many of us understood English at that time, and it was mostly available in English, or in French and German for that matter. But we went along the path of probes and errors, and we proved that we are not different from other societies and other journalism in that we came to basically the same conclusions. Unfortunately, our politicians and tycoons did not come as fast to the same conclusions as, for instance, British or American. Although I do not idealize the English-speaking world in the sphere of mass media, know quite a lot of problems there, but the potent civil society that exists in so-called Western countries is a huge and very effective balance to what people with power and money can do. We still are in the process of forming, but we are well along the way. We went well along the way.
So you mentioned constructive journalism, and I want to go on to that a little bit deeper. What is constructive journalism, and how can an audience recognize it best?
It all goes not only with the essence, but with the form. You can tell people for hours on end that this is right, and this led to the sharp increase in people's well-being or their level of participation in solving their communities' issues and all this kind of stuff. But if you put this into if you do not put this into an appealing, interesting form, then you will lose. So constructive journalism, to my mind, is a serious investigation into how best practices work. And this does mean that if there are hindrances and problems on the way of the work of best practices, you have to talk about them as well. If this is a radio report, for instance, you do not have to only limit your package to an interview with a council head or local activist or another person. You should go to the location. You should record kids at school. You should record also drunk guys or other people at the local store, because radio is about sound, same as television is about video. What the blog is about, it is about not your attitudes, basically. It's about your impressions and the feelings and the sensations that you get. Because people are not so much interested in what we think, or bloggers or whoever. They are interested in whether they can feel the same as we feel and see. And we, with our eyes and ears and nostrils and whatever, we actually are proxies of hundreds and sometimes of millions of people. It is due to us that they receive information. And that's why skills upgrade is very, very important, because you have to be able to really relay what you got to know. So constructive journalism, again, not about painting a rosy picture of what's around you. It's about showing how challenging and at the same time interesting and rewarding the path to something new, maybe. Because people want to exert and to excel. And if you show them how other people excel, they think, hey, we're not worse than those people. Let's try it. Let's probably in another sphere or in another city, in another village, but let's try and do it.
I really like that. I really like how that really captures the fullness of the story and the reality of the story. So I want to kind of bring the part about editorial policy to a close, and I want to ask you, if I didn't know anything about media, I consumed it, but I had no idea where it came from, what should I do to be the best consumer of media, or to consume media in the most accurate way?
Look for those who do not impose their opinion on you. Look for those who aptly illustrate what they are talking about. Illustration in this case may be video, sound, photo, or examples if this is a purely written article. Look for those people or those media outlets who are interested in your opinion. If you are invited to take part in a questionnaire, take part in a questionnaire, be it a phone-in or some internet, multiple choice or non-multiple choice, and then necessarily see how they used what you and other people told them. When I started to work, and this is probably the example, as they say, from the reverse or from the contrary, I did not have journalistic education at all. And I was offered a job after I have written 3 articles as a probe. 2 of them were published, I remember them. 1 of them was not published, and I don't remember about what it was. This is again about the tendency of people's memories to remember what is more pleasant to them. But I came to my first working day, and there was a person who was 3 years older than me, and he was an educated journalist, and he was to be my boss. But he was also my friend still from my university years. And we used to make fun of each other. So he says, listen, do you want to know the 3 basic rules of Soviet journalism that you should follow always, no matter what? No, I say, tell me. Partly because I did want to know this. And he says, first, if you are not allowed to enter through the door, enter through the window. Second, if there's no event that you are to describe, create this event. And third, he says, any lie that benefits the Soviet power is the holy truth. Of course, he was very ironic when he said this, but for quite some time, not only I, but many other people in the Soviet Union had to work for different reasons. This is not to justify what I did then, this is to explain, maybe, the evolution. And very soon I understood that any lie or no lie can be to the benefit of whoever, except of those people who spread this or who commission this lie. Because sooner or later it always surfaces. And by the way, the later it surfaces, the more damage is done to people's psychology. Principle number 2, if there is no event that you have to describe, create it. This is a very wrong principle. And we've seen many times how false sensations were created. So, but if you're not allowed into the door, go through the window applies not only to Soviet journalism, but to journalism all over the world. Because very often we are not allowed into the door. or we are allowed into the door to find ourselves in a trap. So you should always be prepared. If you're not allowed to go through the window, through the chimney, make a tunnel under the and emerge where you expect your the least.